Hello and welcome to English for Philosophy students. We are studying Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and we're in rule number 17. No, rule number 7. And this is our 18th lesson on rule number 7. And I want to say it may be our 37th lesson. Let me find out. No, 65th lesson overall. So lesson 65 in the Jordan Peterson book, lesson 18 in lesson 7. We'll begin with the section called Doubt, Past, Mere Nihilism. First, I want to say past in this context means going even further than or even more than, and then it says mere nihilism. Mere means that what follows it is small and unimportant. So doubt goes beyond nihilism, which is a small thing. That is the suggestion of this title. Let's read. Previously, Jordan has been acting as though nihilism was big and strong. So mere nihilism, to minimize it, really means doubt is very significant. This is what we expect from this title. Okay, let's read. 300 years before Nietzsche, the great philosopher René Descartes set out on an intellectual mission to take his doubt seriously, to break things apart, to get to what was essential, to see if he could establish or discover a single proposition impervious to his skepticism. He was searching for the foundation stone on which proper being could be established. Descartes found it, as far as he was concerned, in the I who thinks, the I who thinks, the I who was aware, as expressed in his famous dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But that I had been conceptualized long before. Thousands of years ago, the aware I was the all-seeing eye of Horus, the great Egyptian sun and sun god, who renewed the state by attending to and then confronting its inevitable corruption. Before that, it was the creator god Marduk of the Mesopotamians, whose eyes encircled his head and who spoke forth words of world-engendering magic. During the Christian epoch, the I transformed into the Logos, the word that speaks order into being at the beginning of time. It might be said that Descartes merely secularized the Logos, turning it more explicitly into that which is aware and thinks. That's the modern self, simply put. But what exactly is that self? Okay, let's go over this paragraph rather quickly. The main idea has to do with the antiquity of the idea that that awareness, the The consciousness of self is the root of being. This paragraph is talking about the fact that that aware self, the I think, therefore I am, Descartes' ground zero, basic bedrock proposition that he is said to have discovered, was actually the bedrock of existence thousands of years earlier in the person of Horus, the Egyptian sun and sun god, who had an all-seeing eye. So Peterson is saying this God embodied the self-conscious awareness, which is the ground of being, and predated Descartes by thousands of years, and Descartes predated Nietzsche by hundreds of years. Okay? And even before Horus, there was the creator god Marduk of the Mesopotamians, who had eyes all around his head. So he was again all-seeing. And his words were creative. They created life. So we see that this god Marduk, who sees everything and is conscious and self-conscious, is also the origin of life. In Christianity, this self-conscious, self-aware personhood at the root of existence became God and Jesus Christ, the Logos. The Word, like creator God Marduk spoke and created, in the same way the Christian God spoke and the world was created. So the Word is the creative force that speaks order into being instead of chaos at the beginning of time. So this whole paragraph is mainly talking about the antiquity of the foundational concept that consciousness is the root of being. Finally, it might be said that phrase means here is a suggestion which may be true. Some people might think. So it might be said that Descartes merely secularized the Logos. So instead of saying Descartes made an enormous discovery of earth-shaking significance, I think, therefore I am, he discovered that the self-aware self-consciousness is the foundation of being. Instead of saying he discovered that, he merely took that concept from religion and secularized it. He took it out of religion and pretended to have thought of it rationally. So this is minimizing Descartes' breakthrough. So it might be said that Descartes merely secularized the Logos, turning it more explicitly into that which is aware and thinks. I think, therefore I am. The Logos was already that, and Descartes repackaged the concept into a secular form and called it the modern self. Simply put, Descartes thinks, therefore Descartes is. This is the foundation of Descartes' rational world, since he doesn't believe in God. But what exactly is that self? That self-conscious I, which seems to be the basic unit of existence. Next paragraph. We can understand, to some degree, its horrors. Whose horrors? The horrors of self, the horrors of human nature, the horrors of any individual person's nature. We can understand, to some degree, its horrors if we wish. Hold on. Okay, so we can understand its horrors if we wish to, but its goodness remains more difficult to define. That is somewhat interesting to me. The horrors of humanity are easy to understand, but the goodness is difficult to define. The self is the great actor of evil, who strode about the stage of being as Nazi and Stalinist alike, who produced Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, and the multiplicity of the Soviet gulags. And all of that must be considered with dread seriousness. But what is its opposite? What is the good that it is the necessary counterpart of that evil that is made more corporeal and comprehensible by the very existence of that evil? And here we can state with conviction and clarity that even the rational intellect, that faculty so beloved of those who hold traditional wisdom in contempt, is at minimum something closely and necessarily akin to the archetypal, dying and eternally resurrected God, the eternal Savior of humanity, the Logos itself. The philosopher of science, Karl Popper, certainly no mystic, regarded thinking itself as a logical extension of the Darwinian process. A creature that cannot think must solely embody its being. It can merely act out its nature, concretely, in the here and now. If it cannot manifest in its behavior what the environment demands while doing so, it will simply die. But that is not true of human beings. We can produce abstracted representations of potential modes of being. We can produce an idea in the theater of the imagination. We can test it out against our other ideas, the ideas of others, or the world itself. If it falls short, we can let it go. We can, in Popper's formulation, let our ideas die in our stead. Then the essential part, the creator of those ideas, can continue onward, now untrammeled by comparison with error. Faith in the part of us that continues across those deaths is a prerequisite to thinking itself. Okay, another hard to understand paragraph, at least to me. It seems to me that the first half of the paragraph is considering the question of how difficult it is to define human nature, to define the self. We can easily define the evil. We have Stalin, we have Nazis, we have gulags. It's easy to see the evil that man is capable of, but harder to explicitly define the opposite of that evil. Some of you may have read a book by C.S. Lewis called The Screwtape Letters. In that book, C.S. Lewis pretends to be a demon who is writing letters to a junior tempter, another demon, about how to undermine and finally capture a soul. And it's kind of a manual about sin and goodness, salvation and damnation, from the point of view of evil. And someone said to C.S. Lewis, you must be so amazing, so wise, so good to be able to write such a book. You must understand holiness and evil, sanctity and corruption so well to be able to show us this in the book. And C.S. Lewis said, well, actually, I wrote the book from the point of view of the demon because I can understand sin from personal experience and temptation from personal experience. He said, I actually tried to write something from the point of view of an angel, maybe a guardian angel of the human being in question. And it was much harder. C.S. Lewis found that it was easy to write from the point of view of evil, but to capture the very breath of heaven in every word, to capture the heroism of the heroically good, he felt it was beyond him. And he never ended up trying to do it. So it is much harder for us to define goodness and greatness than to understand evil. Goodness and greatness are things that we can only describe through stories. Stories of people who did crazy, amazing, self-sacrificing actions that most people would never do. It's much harder to define goodness for us than it is. We're still reaching up to it evolutionarily, according to Jordan Peterson. So, the first half of the paragraph, well, maybe more than that, maybe the whole paragraph is talking about this. Let me re-skim it. We can understand to some degree its horrors, and we said the horrors of the self. If we wish, we can understand it if we wish to. But goodness remains more difficult to define. The self is the great actor of evil. Okay, so we all know ourselves, and ourselves are the great actor of evil. So obviously we know this from the inside. The great actor of evil who strode about the stage of being as Nazi and Stalinist alike. These people are part of our history of what human nature is. This actor of evil who produced Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau concentration camps, the multiplicity of the Soviet gulags, and all of that must be considered with dread seriousness. Dread seriousness is a very strong way of saying that the significance of these incidents in human history on our understanding of self cannot be overstated. If humanity is capable of doing these things, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Soviet gulags, that says something profound about the nature of being and of human nature. But what is its opposite? Much harder for us to see. What is the good that is the necessary counterpart of that evil? That evil is so evil that to find the good that is the opposite would have to be so lofty that it defies our ability to imagine and conceive. What is the good that is the necessary counterpart of that evil? What is the good that is made more corporeal and comprehensible by the very existence of that evil? So we know that if the evil goes that deep, the good must go that high. The presence of the evil creates for us an understanding of the template of the good. And here we can state with conviction and clarity that even the rational intellect, skip this for now, is at minimum something closely and necessarily akin to the archetypal, dying and eternally resurrected God. That would be Jesus or some god in mythology. The eternal Savior of humanity, the Logos itself. So he's saying, we can state with conviction and clarity that even the rational intellect is, at minimum, closely akin to God. So what he's saying is, human nature, self-conscious existence, what we are, although it is capable of incredible evil, it's also capable of good so lofty that it would, really almost touch the good that was demonstrated by Jesus, the good of Christ. And we can pop in and see this part. If you have this, you can always cut out what's in the middle to follow the thread of the sentence and then put it back in as additional information. So even the rational intellect, that faculty so beloved of those who hold traditional wisdom in contempt. So the rational intellect is the darling, is the favorite of secularists and atheists who hold religion as stupid and backward. So they say, like the Descartes of the world, who reject Christianity but then say, I think, therefore I am, as if he had a new idea beyond the Logos. So even just the rational intellect is at minimum closely akin to the dying and resurrected God, the Logos itself. So Jordan Peterson is seeing a similarity, even just with the rational mind, devoid of the soul or the spirit, capable of horrible evil and correspondingly lofty, heroic good. The philosopher of science, Karl Popper, certainly no mystic, so this means Popper was not a Christian man or a religious man, certainly, it says, regarded thinking itself as a logical extension of the Darwinian process. So thinking itself is an evolutionary breakthrough. A creature that cannot think must solely embody its being. Okay, so what we're moving into here, the first half of the paragraph was talking about defining the self. It's easy to define the evil half, but the good half is much harder. And then he transitions into the second half by saying that even just the rational intellect, all by itself, is akin to God. And now he is supporting that with Popper saying that just the act of thinking sets us apart from the animals. A creature that cannot think must solely, that means only, embody its being. So we can't think about what we are, we just have to live it and let some more advanced intelligence observe us and define what we are if we can't think for ourselves. But we ourselves can think and be self-aware. So we are different than this animal. So, a creature that cannot think must solely embody its being, just enflesh it, live it. It can merely, only do a small thing. It can merely act out its nature concretely in the here and now. So it is what it does. A dog is what it does. If it cannot manifest in its behavior what the environment demands while doing so, in other words, while embodying its being concretely, then it will die. So if what the dog does doesn't match what the environment wants, the dog will die. But that is not true of human beings. We adapt. We can produce abstracted representations of potential modes of being. So if an ice age comes, we can imagine putting on warm animal furs and making fires and living in caves and insulating ourselves and preserving food, etc. And then when the ice age goes, we can imagine a new way of life where we are perhaps following herds of cattle or planting crops. We adapt. We can imagine. That's why global warming probably isn't going to be a big problem. Because if the earth heats up little by little and certain areas of the coastlines become flooded, people can imagine moving to the mountains and living there. Therefore, they will move. So we can produce an idea in the theater of the imagination. We can test it out against our other ideas and the ideas of others or the world itself. If it falls short, we can let it go. All this is the process of adapting to our environment because we can imagine things that are different than the reality we are living. We can, in Popper's formulation, let our ideas die in our stead. We don't have to die. We can try this idea, and if it doesn't work, let that one go. Try another idea, and if it doesn't work, let it go. The ideas die, but we live. Then, the essential part, the creator of the ideas, myself, can continue onward. Now untrammeled by comparison with error. Untrammeled means unhindered, not held back anymore by a bad idea because I let that bad idea go. And now I can move forward to a new idea, which is better. Okay? And by comparison means I am not hindered anymore compared to how I was when I had a bad idea. When I had a bad idea, I was hindered. Then I let it go and I can move forward relatively unhindered or untrammeled. Faith in the part of us that continues across those deaths, that is the death of my ideas, my bad ideas, which I let go, but I myself moved on, Faith in that part is a prerequisite to thinking itself. Thinking itself. Okay. We think that is part of the self-conscious I. Now, an idea is not a fact. A fact is something that is dead in and of itself. It has no consciousness, no will to power, no motivation, no action. There are billions of dead facts. The internet is a graveyard of dead facts. But an idea that grips a person is alive. It wants to express itself, to live in the world. It is for this reason that the depth psychologists, Freud and Jung, paramount among them, insisted that the human psyche was a battleground for ideas. An idea has an aim. It wants something. It posits a value structure. An idea believes that what it is aiming for is better than what we have now. It reduces the world to those things that aid or impede its realization, and it reduces everything else to irrelevance. An idea defines figure against ground. An idea is a personality, not a fact. When it manifests itself within a person, it has a strong proclivity to make of that person its avatar, to impel that person to act it out. Act what out? Act out the idea. Sometimes that impulsion, possession is another word, can be so strong that the person will die rather than allowing the idea to perish. This is, generally speaking, a bad decision, given that it is often the case that only the idea need die, and that the person with the idea can stop being its avatar, change his or her ways, and continue. Okay, so the whole paragraph is an extended compare and contrast, mostly contrast, between a fact and an idea. A fact being simply a proposition, some mathematical truth or some scientific fact. These facts, which are not up for debate, everyone agrees on them. They don't have the power to motivate people and to turn people into radicals, to turn people into activists. Ideas, which could be right or wrong, have the character of the power to grip a human being or even to possess a human being. Ideas generally are in the theater of the imagination, as it said in the previous paragraph. When we were speaking of the Ice Age and the caveman having an idea of how to live that would be different from what he was doing, and so he tried it out and survived. Ideas are very powerful. And somebody, who was it, said, Freud and Jung, the depth psychologists, the psychologists who look deep into the human psyche, said that the human psyche is a battleground for ideas. Actually, this is a very relevant thing today, because right now, Western civilization is being destroyed, dismantled, institution by institution, by an idea, the idea of utopian socialism. It's interesting to see how this very bad idea has possessed the world, the free world, to the point where the free world is willing to hand over its freedom to dictators for no reason. Anyway, let's continue. So, an idea defines figure against ground. An idea is a personality, not a fact. The person becomes the avatar of the idea. The person will die rather than allow the idea to perish and become a martyr. This is a bad decision because the idea could die and then the person could go on. Let us move on. To use the dramatic conceptualization of our ancestors, it is the most fundamental convictions that must die, must be sacrificed, when the relationship with God has been disrupted, when the presence of undue and often intolerable suffering, for example, indicates that something has to change. The most fundamental convictions must die. This is, that was wrong. This is to say nothing other than that the future can be made better if the proper sacrifices take place in the present. Those of you who have been with me throughout this lesson will remember this from the beginning of the lesson, and other lessons as well. This idea that way back in time, human beings discovered that something they could do now might make the future better. And that was the beginning of a sacrificial system where we propitiate gods. So he's back to that now. The future can be made better if the proper sacrifices take place in the present. No other animal has ever figured this out. And it took us, and here he's going to go into his evolutionary biology, the proposition that human beings have been evolving for literally millions of years. I'm not sure I subscribe to any of this, but this is Jordan Peterson's belief, or at least how he describes the development of the philosophies of humanity that we hold today. So he says, no other animal has ever figured this out, and it took us untold hundreds of thousands of years to do it, to figure this out about sacrifice. It took further eons of observation and hero worship, and then millennia of study to distill that idea into a story, like the story of Cain and Abel, the stories of Genesis, which are the earliest stories in recorded history of mankind. So what he's saying is it was untold hundreds of thousands of years, plus eons of observation, plus millennia of study, before we got to the point 5,000 years ago when the stories of Genesis were being written. It then took additional vast stretches of time to assess the story, to incorporate it so that now we can simply say, if you are disciplined and privilege the future over the present, you can change the structure of reality in your favor. So if you are disciplined, in other words, you have self-control, self-discipline, and you privilege the future over the present. In other words, you defer gratification. You save your money now so that you can buy a house later, or you endure hunger now so that you can be skinny for the beach, or you spend quality time with your partner now, even if you're tired, so that in the future you will have a good relationship with him or her. So that's what privilege the future over the present means. So if you do that, you can reap rewards in the future. So he is saying that this whole concept of sacrifice so that the future will be better took gazillions of millennia for us to evolve into it. And we really aren't fully there. I mean, you can see us continuing to stretch upward to understand goodness. We don't really understand goodness yet. Okay, so anyway, we want to reap rewards in the future. How best to do that? How should we act so that we will change the structure of reality in our favor? So he moves on. In 1984, I, meaning Jordan Peterson, started down the same road as Descartes. This means intellectually, Jordan Peterson began to doubt everything and search for some foundational proposition that he could believe and begin to build his worldview upon. So he started down that path which Descartes is known to have trod. I did not know it was the same road as Descartes at the time, and I am not claiming kinship with Descartes, who is rightly regarded as one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Let's do this. But I was truly plagued with doubt. So here we have the but. He says, I'm not claiming that I am akin to Descartes. Descartes is one of the best philosophers ever. But I was plagued with doubt. So I am not like Descartes in magnitude, but I am like him in that I was plagued by doubt. I had outgrown the shallow Christianity of my youth by the time I could understand the fundamentals of Darwinian theory. So when he was old enough to understand Darwin, he had already rejected Christianity, Jordan Peterson. He had outgrown the shallow Christianity. So what he is saying is the form of Christianity he believed as a child was not deep and not profound. And at some point he rejected it. And then later he encountered and understood Darwin. After that, I could not distinguish the basic elements of Christian belief from wishful thinking. So this means after he rejected shallow Christianity and embraced Darwinism and understood it, Christianity only seemed to be wishful thinking. He identified Christianity and wishful thinking. He thought anyone who is a Christian because they want heaven. They are just believing because they want to believe that there is an eternal happy place after death. This is wishful thinking, not profound belief. So, after he embraced Darwinism and rejected Christianity, he no longer could see value or depth in Christianity. He simply thought Christianity was wishful thinking. The socialism that soon afterwards became so attractive to me as an alternative to his former Christianity proved equally unsubstantial. So, he is giving his history. The next thing that came was socialism, and it was attractive, especially because he had rejected Christianity and needed an alternative. And socialism seemed like a good alternative at first, but later it proved, that means with time he began to see that it was insubstantial, equally insubstantial to Christianity. In other words, Christianity and socialism are both wishful thinking and to be discarded. Moving on. With time, I came to understand through the great George Orwell that much of such thinking found its motivation in hatred of the rich instead of true regard for the poor. Okay, so if you have never read the novels of George Orwell, Animal Farm and 1984 are two must-reads. They're two books that you must read to understand what is happening today and to understand what happened in the 20th century. And Animal Farm is easy to read. It is an allegory of the socialist and communist takeover of Russia using the analogy of animals on a farm. It's easy to read, and it is eerily prescient of what's happening today. The same with 1984. Both of these exhibit allegorically what the Russian communists did in a way that makes it easy to understand. And you can see it's happening again right now with the globalist powers, which have taken over, are in the process of taking over the world, but they basically own big tech and are largely involved in the socialist takeover of the United States right now. So anyway, Jordan Peterson read the books of George Orwell, who he calls the great George Orwell, and the veil was taken from his eyes, and he was able to see that socialists pretend to care about the poor and to do what they do for love of the poor, but really they're motivated by hatred of the rich. They're not motivated by love of the poor. They're motivated by hatred of the rich. They are not angels of mercy. They are demons of greed and hatred. And this truth was made clear to Jordan Peterson by reading the novels of George Orwell. And this unmasked socialism for him. So he was never able to be fooled by the socialist ideology and rhetoric after that. Okay, so this is one of the reasons he rejected socialism. Besides, and this besides makes us think that additional reasons to reject socialism are coming. So in addition, besides means sort of like in addition, the socialists were more intrinsically capitalistic than the capitalists. So inwardly, essentially, the socialists cared more about money and power than the capitalists did. They believed just as strongly in money. So this clarifies what he means by they are more capitalist than the capitalists, meaning they believe in money, socialists. They just thought that if different people had the money, the problems plaguing humanity would vanish. So the socialists pretended that they didn't care about money and that capitalists were greedy. But truly, the socialists were greedy and they wanted money as much or more than the capitalists did. And the only way they thought there was something better in the socialist utopia was that they themselves would have the money instead of the people who earned it through capitalism. That was the only difference. Who has the money? And in the socialist utopia, the socialists have it. In the capitalist world, those who earn it have it. So anyway. So, socialists believed just as strongly in money as capitalists. They just thought this just is here because it means the only difference, they only thought, the only difference between them is that they thought. That's what this word just means. They just thought that if different people had the money, the problems plaguing humanity would vanish. This is simply untrue. It is not true that giving money to a different set of people will make a big difference. There are many problems that money does not, hold on. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble here. There are many problems that money does not solve, and others, meaning other problems, that money, it meaning money, makes worse. There are many problems that money does not solve, and other problems that money makes worse. Rich people still divorce each other. So he is going to support the idea that money doesn't solve all the problems. There's the problem of divorce. Rich people divorce each other. They alienate themselves from their children. Money does not solve that. And they suffer from existential angst. So money does not give you peace. You can still have angst. And they develop cancer and dementia and die alone and unloved. These are the terrible things that money either cannot help you with or maybe even makes it worse. Recovering addicts cursed with money blow it all in a frenzy of snorting and drunkenness. So this is another support for the idea that money can make things worse. If you are a recovering addict, that means you are off drugs and you're getting your life back in order. And if all of a sudden someone gives you money, there's a great temptation to go out and buy drugs and ruin your life again. And finally, boredom weighs heavily upon people who have nothing to do. If you have if you have money, then you have no need to go out and work, and that can cause boredom. So these are all the reasons why the socialists are mistaken if they think that simply taking money from the rich and giving it to the socialists, that will solve the problem of suffering. Okay, moving on. This last paragraph we just read started out with Jordan Peterson's history of thought, how he went into doubt. Now we will continue. I, meaning Jordan, was simultaneously tormented by the fact of the Cold War. So simultaneously means two things were happening at the same time. So one of them was the intellectual progression into doubt of the previous paragraph. And then simultaneously, he also was tormented by the fact of the Cold War. The Cold War was the hostile standoff between the United States and Russia in the 20th century. This was accompanied by an arms race where each side was building a nuclear arsenal, bigger and bigger, pointed at each other. And the idea at the time was, there were two ideas. One was called mutually assured destruction, MAD, that no one would ever use a weapon, a nuclear weapon, because there was the certainty that the first person who sent it would still be destroyed, because both parties would be destroyed. So the fact of mutually assured destruction would save us from using these weapons. That was one idea of the Cold War. The other idea, the exact opposite idea, was that never in the history of mankind have we made a weapon and not used it. So the idea that we would make all these weapons and never use them seemed a very risky proposition. So the Cold War was mostly in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. It was this armed, hostile standoff between the United States and Russia as the two world powers. Okay. And Jordan was tormented by the situation, as were most of us. Most thinking people knew we were living under a sword of Damocles. The story of Damocles was a king who lived in great luxury, but he had a sword suspended over his head by a thread, which at any moment the thread could break and it would kill him. So at any moment he knew he could die, and he thought it very likely that he would definitely die sometime or other from that sword. We all lived that way in the 20th century. So Jordan says, I was simultaneously tormented by the fact of the Cold War. It obsessed me. He was very tormented by it, very upset about it. It gave me nightmares. It drove me into the desert. This is figuratively. Jesus Christ was driven to the desert to fight with the enemy of his soul, the devil. So it suggests that it pushed Jordan into a desert place, a place where he had to wrestle with his own demons, into the long night of the human soul. There is something called dark night of the soul, which is a Christian concept from a long time ago. St. John of the Cross wrote a book called Dark Night of the Soul. The idea is that there is a place of psychic torment where Christians who are highly advanced, usually, or maybe not, you become advanced through going through this dark night of the soul. I think he is sort of alluding to this, but secularizing it. So it drove me into the desert, into the long night of the human soul. I could not understand how it had come to pass that the world's two great factions aimed mutual assured destruction, there you have it, MAD, at each other. He's like, he couldn't accept that this is happening. Was one system just as arbitrary and corrupt as the other? Capitalism versus communism? Were they both equally evil and crazy that they could do this? Was it a mere matter of opinion? Were all value structures merely clothing of power? He was probably brought up to believe that the West, Canada and the United States, were good, and that Russia was evil, and that we were the forces of good against evil. But he couldn't really accept that the United States was doing the exact same thing as the evil Russia. They were building weapons of mass destruction. And it was making him say, is it possible that there is no difference between good and evil, that they're the same? I myself feel a little bit this way about the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. I used to think that the Republicans were good and that the Democrats were bad. I still think the Democrats are bad, but I have learned to mistrust the Republicans too. There was a time not too long ago that the Republicans had both houses of Congress and the presidency. It was a short time, 2 years, when they could have outlawed abortion, corrected the deficit spending so that our economy would become stabilized. They could have made major changes to education policy so that our children wouldn't be being taught to hate America in the public schools. There are many things they could have done. They could have rolled back welfare and entitlement spending and entitlement programs that create wealth. It creates a culture of dependency and a permanent poor underclass. There are many things they could have done, and they didn't do anything. And the fact that they did not do anything unmasked them for me. And I became aware that it was not true, that the Democrats and the Republicans were fighting against each other for the good of America, but rather both parties were only in it to maintain power for themselves. So, anyway, this is what Jordan Peterson was going through with the idea that good and evil are only merely the clothing of power, all value structures, that they were deceptively masking a heart of desire for power, and that they were not fundamentally different. Was everyone crazy? This is the cry of a man at his last, a man like Jordan Peterson who desires rationality and order and goodness. This would be a desperate cry from such a man. I think that my clock isn't working because it looks like we've been on for an hour, and my clock says it's only been a little over half an hour. So we're going to have to end soon. Hold on one sec. Okay, let's go ahead and end here because there's quite a bit left in this section. I had hoped to finish this section today, but it looks like we aren't going to. So let's go ahead and end here, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.